Assalamu alaikum. How are you people? I'm fine and I'm here to discuss case number 38 because last time we did case number 36 and 37. So let's see what is it. It's a very important topic and very important differential diagnosis that I'm going to discuss with you. So let's see. Okay, here is the case. About 30 years old man presents with abdominal distension with gurgling sounds, abdominal pain and diarrhea of long-standing duration. There is history of weight loss during past 6 weeks, having such attacks frequently with remission lasting for variable periods. No history of blood per rectum. Pain is localized to central abdomen in the right iliac fossa. With these episodes, has occasional fever with these episodes, right? So this is the clinical history, and on examination, patient has anemia, glossitis and weight loss. Tenderness and a mass is in the right iliac fossa. Liver is palpable, hemoglobin of 10 gram per deciliter, WBC 10,000 per cubic millimeter, ESR is 80 millimeter in the first hour, potassium is 3.8, sodium is 140 milliequivalent per liter, bicarbonate 33, urea 4.4 millimole per liter, phosphate 0.72, calcium 2.28, creatinine 87.4 millimole per liter, total protein 66 gram per liter, albumin 29 gram per liter, urinalysis is normal. So the case is with this chronic history of abdominal pain and diarrhea. Now let's see what they have asked. They have asked in question number 1, what is the differential diagnosis, because it can be of so many diseases, so we will discuss the differential. Number 2, they have asked what additional investigations are required, and number 3, how will you manage this patient. So let's see by seeing again this history. That 30-year-old man, and main problem with him is with abdominal distension, pain, diarrhea off and on, and there is marked history of weight loss as well, and it is stated that he becomes well for a variable period of time and then again develops abdominal pain and diarrhea. So it is recurrent with episodes, and there is no history of blood PR. That is point to be noted, that no blood per rectally, and that pain is central and towards the right iliac fossa, right? And he also gives history of fever with the episodes. On examination, he has anemia and glossitis and weight loss, nutritional deficiencies he is showing. Tenderness and a mass is palpable in the right iliac fossa. Liver is also palpable with calcium is low, you see phosphate is low, and total proteins and albumin is low, right? Now with the differential diagnosis, first of all, that is very common in our country is number 1 is intestinal tuberculosis, number 2 is Crohn's disease, number 3 it can be intestinal lymphoma, number 4 it can be protein losing enteropathy, and number 5 cecal carcinoma. So you should know the differential diagnosis of mass in the right iliac fossa, right? They are indicating. So first is intestinal tuberculosis or abdominal tuberculosis, second is Crohn's disease, and third is cecal carcinoma, right? So we have made all these differential diagnosis. Now one by one I have to discuss each so that you can make out, because accordingly we will manage the patient. Management will be depending upon the diagnosis. So you have to explain each and every differential diagnosis that you are writing, plus how will you manage each of this. It will be depending upon your differential. So if you are suspecting, and you should suspect, now intestinal tuberculosis It is caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis or Mycobacterium bovis. Active pulmonary tuberculosis is present in less than 50% of the cases. So don't think that chest X-ray will be showing anything. In less than 50% cases, so mostly the patient's chest X-ray will be normal. In less than 50% cases, it can show pulmonary lesion. Most frequent site of involvement is ileocecal region, but any part of the gut may be involved, but that's the most important part. It causes mucosal ulceration, scarring and fibrosis with narrowing of the lumen. Patient may be without symptoms or complains of chronic abdominal pain, obstructive symptoms, weight loss and diarrhea. And abdominal mass may also be palpable, as in this case. Complications include intestinal obstruction, hemorrhage and fistula formation. So these things you can find, and I remember that it is very important that you should take note of how the disease presents, because tuberculosis can be presented in very atypical symptoms, right? So when I started my consultancy after passing my FCPS, one patient came and she was 21 years old, I remember, and she had fever, high grade fever, and no other complaint. High grade fever for last 18 to 20 days, and I did everything. It became pyrexia of unknown origin, and finally with some clues, because she had tenderness in her right iliac fossa, abdominal pain, no diarrhea, and it came out to be, on CT scan it came out to be intestinal tuberculosis. So I am telling you, this can be presented in very peculiar manner, very vague symptoms, and this was one of the symptom in my patient that I, and you might have seen a lot of patients who are not responding to treatment, and when you start anti-tuberculosis therapy, it's like a magic, and it causes so much improvement in a patient with very peculiar picture, atypical symptoms to be presented with, right? Now Crohn's disease number 2, differential diagnosis. In the Crohn's disease also there is intermittent bouts of low-grade fever, diarrhea and right lower quadrant pain. Right lower quadrant mass and tenderness may be palpable. Perianal disease with abscess, fistula. Transmural involvement with mucosal ulceration, strictures, inflammation, fistula development and abscess formation. Cigarette smoking is associated with cigarette smoking. Malabsorption arises from bacterial overgrowth with enterocolic fissures, stricture and stasis plus protein losing enteropathy results due to mucosal damage, right? So everything can occur in Crohn's disease also. It can be a differential of your such a scenario. Number 3, you can make a differential of intestinal lymphoma as well. Now intestinal lymphoma may arise in gastrointestinal tract primarily or may involve it secondarily in patients with disseminated disease. Majority are non-Hodgkin's, intermediate or high-grade B-cell lymphoma. Most common histologic type is non-Hodgkin extranodal marginal zone, that is MALT B-cell lymphoma. T-cell lymphoma may arise with association with the celiac disease, you know celiac sprue. And lymphoma may arise in the setting of immunoproliferative small intestinal disease. Other types of intestinal lymphoma include primary intestinal follicular cell lymphoma, mantle cell lymphoma, and Burkitt lymphoma. It causes weight loss, diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, and malabsorption. So anything can happen, just like in intestinal tuberculosis and Crohn's disease. It can also result in the same picture. Then the early pre-malignant phase may respond to antibiotic therapy for H. pylori. Primary lymphoma presents with abdominal pain, weight loss, nausea, vomiting, distension, and occult blood in stool. Protein losing enteropathy results in hypoalbuminemia. So in any of the gastrointestinal disorder, protein losing enteropathy can result, which leads to hypoalbuminemia or hypoproteinemia. Then another diagnosis you can make of protein losing enteropathy. It comprises a number of conditions that results in excessive loss of serum proteins into the gastrointestinal tract. Hypoalbuminemia is sine qua non of protein-losing enteropathy. However, the serum proteins such as alpha-1 antitrypsin also are lost from the gut epithelium. So in this, alpha-1 antitrypsin can also be lost, not only albumin. In protein-losing enteropathy caused by lymphatic obstruction, loss of lymphatic fluid commonly results in lymphocytopenia less than 1000 per microliter, hypoalbuminemia and hypocholesterolemia. It is recognized as a sequelae of a known GI disorder, or in patients with in patients with unclear cause. Evaluation is indicated and guided by the clinical suspicion. So, it's not only malabsorption that results from the primary disorder of intestinal epithelium like celiac sprue or Whipple's disease. It can occur in any GI disorder, right? So, evaluation is needed, because initially you cannot make a diagnosis of why malabsorption is occurring in this case. So you have to think about protein losing enteropathy, and you have to you have to consider evaluation for protein losing enteropathy then, if no diagnosis is made in such a patient. So protein losing enteropathy must be distinguished from other causes of hypoalbuminemia, which includes liver disease, nephrotic syndrome and heart failure, right? So you have to exclude all these, and then you will consider protein losing enteropathy, and you will confirm by other tests which are primarily for protein losing enteropathy, which can be a differential, and we will discuss the test later in this discussion. Now they have asked about the investigation, that how will you confirm. If you are thinking about the differential, now you have to do the relevant investigations, and you have to exclude or include, right? So if you are suspecting abdominal tuberculosis, you will do purified protein derivative PPT skin test. It may be negative. Mostly it is negative in intestinal tuberculosis. Number 2, you will ask for a chest x-ray, and I have already told you that in less than 50% cases only chest x-ray will be positive for infiltrates, otherwise it will be normal. Number 3, abdominal CT may show thickening of the cecum and ileocecal valve and massive mesenteric lymphadenopathy. That is very important, If you cannot make a diagnosis, as I have told you, my patient presented with high-grade fever for the last 20 days, young patient without any history of any other relevant symptoms indicating for intestinal tuberculosis, no diarrhea, no mass, but she had some tenderness on the right iliac fossa. That's why I got CT done, and it showed thickening of the cecum and mesenteric lymphadenopathy, which was confirming tuberculosis. So number 4, you will ask for a colonoscopy, which demonstrates an ulcerated mass, multiple ulcers with steep edges and adjacent small sessile polyps, edema or erosion or small diverticula, most commonly in the ileocecal region. So you can find these changes in the ileocecal region most commonly, but anywhere in the GI you can find. Number 5, endoscopic or surgical biopsy establishes the diagnosis, revealing acid-fast bacilli, caseating granuloma, or positive culture from the organism. So detection of tubercle bacilli and biopsy specimen by PCR is the most sensitive means of diagnosis, because you cannot find every time the caseating granuloma in your biopsy specimen, or if you can find granuloma, it does not necessarily confirms tuberculosis, so you have to do the PCR to confirm by the presence of tubercle bacilli, right? Now, what will you do if it comes out to be a Crohn's disease? With the test, all these are negative, then you will do number 1, complete blood count. Blood count will show you anemia and leukocytosis. Now, why anemia? In Crohn's disease, anemia will be due to the chronic inflammation, anemia of chronic disease, or due to the malabsorption of iron, or it could be a megaloblastic anemia due to the malabsorption of vitamin B12 from the ileum. and it would show you leukocytosis. Why? Because inflammatory mediators are there. There is infiltration by the leukocytes. So you will find leukocytosis in the acute flare-up of the disease. And serum albumin shows hypoalbuminemia because there is malabsorption. Number 3, ESR and CRP. Now ESR will be raised like it is raised in this case 80 millimeter in the first hour, and this CRP will be raised, right? And CRP corresponds, raise in the CRP corresponds with the acute flare of the disease, but in many patients even CRP becomes normal and there is acute flare up. So what you do in such a scenario? There is a very good non-invasive test for that, which is fecal calprotectin. Elevated levels correlate with active inflammation as demonstrated by ileocolonoscopy or radiologic CT or MR enterography. It is so excellent, so sensitive, that if it comes to be positive, it is equivalent to what you find in colonoscopy or MR enterography, right? So it gives you the clue for acute flare-up of Crohn's disease. Then you will do stool DR and stool CS for pathogen, microscopy for ova or parasite if it is something else, Clostridium difficile toxin by toxin assays, or by rapid multiplex PCR diagnostic assessment, occult blood test. So you will do all these tests and they will be negative. In case of Crohn's disease, no ova, no parasite, no C. difficile toxin, right? The diagnosis of Crohn's disease is based upon a compatible clinical picture with supporting endoscopic, pathologic and radiographic finding. Number 1, ileocolonoscopy you will do. To obtain the biopsy specimen, 25% shows granuloma. Only, as you know that Crohn's disease histologically it is a granulomatous disease, but less than 25% of cases granuloma is shown. Endoscopic findings are epithoid, linear or stellate ulcerations, stricture and segmental involvement with areas of normal appearing mucosa adjacent to inflamed mucosa. That is the most particular sign which distinguishes it from ulcerative colitis, is that you have cobblestone like appearance in the colonoscopy, that they are normal appearing mucosa and then inflamed mucosa, then again normal appearing mucosa. In ulcerative colitis, there is continuous abnormality in whole of the tract or colon or wherever it is involved, right? Number 2, you will do CT or MR enterography for small bowel involvement, which may show bowel wall thickening and vascularity, mucosal enhancement and fat stranding, right? Number 3, you can do capsule imaging if radiography normal or diagnostic. If you cannot find anything in radiography, then you can do capsule imaging. Number 4, flexible sigmoidoscopy to evaluate colon. Number 5, barium upper gastrointestinal series with small bowel follow-through should no longer be performed except where CT or MR enterography is unavailable. You know, okay. So if you have got CT and MR enterography available, don't do these tests because they are very excellent in evaluating the patient for Crohn's disease. So don't do barium upper gastrointestinal series. But when I was making this PowerPoint presentation from the what I wrote in my notes back in 2005-2006, it was written first investigation was barium upper gastrointestinal series, but now I have taken the reference from current medical diagnosis and treatment of 2022. If it is available now, that 2022 edition is available, so I have downloaded and I have seen that it's not no more than, right? Complications you should know of Crohn's disease, that abscess can be formed, obstruction, intestinal obstruction. Number 3, abdominal and rectovaginal fistulas can be formed, perianal disease, which can manifest as fissures or fistula or skin tags. Then carcinoma, it can be converted into carcinoma, hemorrhage, and malabsorption. These are all complications. Then investigations for lymphoma. If it is also negative, all these tests, then barium radiograph localizes the site of lesion. Then endoscopic percutaneous or laparoscopic biopsy that you have already done will show no such thing as Crohn's disease. Then you will go for the biopsy to determine the stage, chest and abdominal, CT scan, bone marrow biopsy, and in some cases lymphography will be required to stage lymphoma, right? Now for protein losing enteropathy. So we have made 4 differential. The last is protein losing enteropathy, because this patient in our scenario it is giving the malabsorptive symptoms and signs. So protein losing enteropathy is confirmed by determining the gut alpha-1 antitrypsin clearance, 24-hour volume of feces multiplied by stool concentration of alpha-1 antitrypsin divided by serum alpha-1 antitrypsin concentration. That's how you diagnose this protein losing enteropathy. A clearance of more than 27 milliliter per 24 hour is abnormal. If you cannot make any diagnosis, then you have to think about protein losing enteropathy. And protein losing enteropathy can result from all these diseases, and any disease in the gastrointestinal tract. Primarily, if you cannot make a diagnosis, then you have to do this test to confirm protein losing enteropathy. Then you will point out by investigations which disease is giving rise to protein losing enteropathy. So you will do next investigation of serum protein electrophoresis. Then you will do lymphocyte count. As lymphocyte count is decreased, we have seen if there is lymphatic obstruction, lymphocyte count will be decreased and there will be hypocholesterolemia, right? Then force serum cholesterol to look for evidence of lymphatic obstruction. Number 5, stool qualitative fecal fat determination for malabsorption. And number 6, intestinal imaging with small bowel enteroscopy to localize what's going on, which disease is giving rise to protein losing enteropathy. Number 7, colonoscopy for colonic disease. So if you do colonoscopy and you will find normal mucosa adjacent to abnormal mucosa and then again normal mucosa, you can get the diagnosis of Crohn's disease or Crohn's disease, intestinal lymphoma, abdominal tuberculosis. All can result in protein losing enteropathy. So number 8, you will do the CT scan of abdomen to look for neoplasms or lymphatic obstruction, right? Now they have asked about the management. So management, according to the diagnosis for intestinal tuberculosis, you will give standard anti-tuberculous therapy and electrolyte support to the patient. So you should know each and everything about anti-tuberculous therapy, and I am not going to give you any discussion with it. You might be knowing very well. Treatment of Crohn's disease I have written in detail. This is the latest information that I have gathered from 2022 edition of Current Medical Diagnosis. So let's see. All patients should be counseled for smoking cessation because it is strongly associated with smoking. Now you have to see if the disease is mild and low risk. What should be the nutrition? Well-balanced diet with only few restrictions. Eating small frequent meals. Avoid fried and greasy food. Can have lactose intolerance, so off dairy products, ask them to avoid dairy products. Probiotic have no proven benefit, so don't give. Number 2, symptomatic medications will be loperamide 2 to 4 milligram for diarrhea up to 4 times a day. So for mild disease you can do that. Specific therapy depends upon the location of the disease involvement. In mild to low risk patient we are talking about. If it is involving terminal ileum and ascending colon, then Extended release budesonide 9 milligram once daily for 8 weeks, which induces remission in 50 to 75% of the patients. If remission is achieved, budesonide is tapered over 2 to 4 weeks in 3 milligram increments and patient is observed. Now after tapering, you stop it and observe the patient. Number 2, mild colon disease if only colon is involved. If terminal ileum is involved with a part of ascending colon, then you will give budesonide, right? But if mild colonic disease is there, then you will use 5 amino salicylic acid agents that releases mesalamine, Esacol 2.4 to 4.8 gram per day or Pentasa 4 gram per day, right? If left-sided or diffuse colitis is present, then you will start with the oral corticosteroid. Prednisone or prednisolone are recommended in such a case. The initial dose of either agent is 40 milligram once daily for 1 to 2 weeks, followed in those who respond by gradual tapering of 5 to 10 milligram per week over 4 to 8 weeks. Number 4, sulfasalazine 1.5 to 3 gram orally twice daily, benefit confined to the colon, because sulfasalazine you are not going to use in case of ileal involvement. When the disease is confined to the colon, then you are going to give 2 to 4 gram per day in long-term maintenance. Long-term follow-up in patients with mild disease who respond to initial therapy with budesonide or prednisone. Treatment should be discontinued. Then you taper it properly and then discontinue, and patient should be monitored periodically for recurrence, like he will develop symptoms or CRP will be raised, or even if CRP is not raised, then fecal calprotectin will be raised, or endoscopy every 1 to 2 yearly. If the patient is normal, do 2 yearly endoscopy for the follow-up. Patient who respond to sulfasalazine or other 5-ASA should continue long-term maintenance therapy. In such a case, you have to continue it long-term basis, the treatment. Patient with mild disease who either do not respond to initial therapy or who experience symptom relapse more than once every 1 to 2 years following tapering of corticosteroids should be reclassified as moderate to high risk for disease progression and stepped up to more potent therapies, right? The patients who are developing acute flare-ups every now and then, every 1 to 2 years, you have to label them again for moderate or high risk patient. There are no more low risk patient or mild patient, right? So you have to step up the therapy. Now what you will do in moderate to high risk Crohn's disease? Biologic agents or immunomodulators or both are needed to promote and sustain remission. So you have to use that in such a case, nutrition. Patient with obstructive symptoms should be placed on a low roughage diet. That is, no raw fruits or vegetables, popcorns or nuts, etc. Short-term total parenteral nutrition with parenteral vitamin B12 and oral vitamin D supplements for patients with extensive terminal ileal disease or previous ileal resection, अगर उनका पहले हो चुका है. Symptomatic therapy involvement of terminal ileum may lead to reduced absorption of acid and may induce secretory diarrhea from the colon. This secretory diarrhea responds to agents that bind the malabsorbed bile salts, that is cholestyramine 2 to 4 gram or cholestyramine 1 to 2 gram 1 to 3 times daily with a meal. In such a case, there is secretory diarrhea and due to the malabsorbed bile salts. So you have to give cholestyramine or cholestyramine, which binds with these malabsorbed bile salts. Steatorrhea is treated with low fat diet. You will not advise the fatty diet. There is high risk of bacterial overgrowth due to anterior fistula, ileal resection and impaired motility, and may benefit from broad spectrum antibiotics. Antidiarrheal may provide benefit in some cases like loperamide. So if the patient has already undergone a resection of ileum, then you have to give antibiotic also. The drug therapy, number 1, corticosteroids give dramatic improvement in both small and large bowel disease, but do not alter the natural history of the underlying disease. But you have to start corticosteroid, right? They give magical improvement. Admission is advised for those who develop high fever, persistent vomiting, evidence of intestinal obstruction, severe weight loss, severe abdominal tenderness, or suspicion of an abscess. If you have a suspicion of abscess, you should do CT scan of the abdomen before starting corticosteroid. Don't give corticosteroid because patient will be needing surgery if abscess is present. If no abscess, first you have to exclude abscess and then you will start parenteral steroid, that is methylprednisolone 40 to 60 milligram daily. Outpatients with moderate to severe disease may be treated with oral prednisone for 1 to 2 weeks, followed by slow tapering of 5 to 10 per week over 4 to 8 weeks, right? Number 2, biologic agent is initiated as corticosteroid is tapered and withdrawn. If a decision is made not to initiate a biologic agent, long-term treatment with immunomodulator, that is azathioprine, mercaptopurine or methotrexate is recommended to provide steroid-free maintenance. Because when you start steroids, they will give magical improvement to the patient, and when you are tapering, then you will add a biologic agent, right? Biologic agents do not give a dramatic improvement. That is why first you stabilize the patient with the corticosteroid intravenous and then you start with the biologic agent when you are tapering off and stop the steroid. And if you don't have decided to give biologic agent, then you have to give immunomodulators like azathioprine, mercaptopurine or methotrexate, right? To keep the patient off steroid. Now what are the biologic? First is anti-tumor necrotic factor therapies. Infliximab or adalimumab to induce remission either as monotherapy or with combination with azathioprine, mercaptopurine or methotrexate. Intravenous based infliximab infusion may be preferred to subcutaneous fixed dose adalimumab. So first line of therapy in such a case is infliximab. Second, you can give certolizumab, appears to be inferior to other anti-TNF. Like first you will try infliximab or adalimumab if patient develop some side effects or difficult to tolerate, then you will do this second line drug, that is certolizumab. With combination therapy, there are more chances of myelosuppression, infections and malignancies, that is lymphoma and skin cancer. What you have to do, you have to measure serum anti-TNF trough levels and drug antibody levels may guide therapy who have lost response, because patient develop anti-TNF antibodies and benefit goes away. So patients with low serum anti-TNF trough levels and absent drug antibodies should receive increased anti-TNF dosing, infliximab 10 mg per kilogram, adalimumab 80 mg, or decreased dosing interval, infliximab every 6 weeks and adalimumab every week. Patients with high antibody to anti-TNF and low anti-TNF drop should be switched to another anti-TNF agent. Now you have to give, because no more benefit is obtained with anti-TNF or infliximab or adalimumab. So what will you do then? Patients with inadequate response despite adequate anti-TNF trough levels should be changed to an alternative biologic agent such as vedolizumab or ustekinumab. नंबर 2, एंटी-एंटीग्रेन्स. अब ये जो है ना एंटी-एंटीग्रेन, पहला तो हमारा हो गया, फर्स्ट इज अवर biologic agent is anti-TNF therapies, that is infliximab and adalimumab. Second is anti-antigrins therapy. It involves vedolizumab 300 mg every 8 weeks. Then number 3, anti-interleukin 12 and anti-interleukin 23 antibody, which is known as ustekinumab. It is recommended for those who do not respond to conventional therapy or developing side effects. Single dose of intravenous ustekinumab is given. Right? Now you should always know what are the indications for surgery, because you have to, if you are treating Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, you always take surgeon's opinion. So 50% of the patient require at least one surgical procedure in their life, ileal or ileocolic resection or structuroplasty. Indications would be intractability to medical therapy, they are not improving. Number 2, intra-abdominal abscess, then needs surgical debridement. Number 3, massive bleeding if there is. Number 4, refractory internal or perianal fistulas, you have to have surgery. Number 5, intestinal obstruction. Of course, in cases of stricture formation and intestinal obstruction, you have to have surgery. Prognosis: with proper medical and surgical treatment, most of the patients are able to cope with chronic disease and its complications and lead productive lives. Few patients die as a direct consequence of the disease. They develop severe hemorrhage, abscess formation, or anything. I've seen a lot of patients when I was doing my job before ever starting or ever thinking about FCPS Part 2. I was doing my duties as RMO in a hospital, that was OMI hospital, and there was Surgeon Mumtaz Meher who used to do surgeries, and I remember a lot of patients undergoing colostomy after ileocolectomy, and they had colostomy bags, so I think that I was lucky enough. When I was not doing anything, I was gaining so much knowledge, because I was not doing surgery, so how would I know that how to take care of colostomy bag and everything, it is done just temporarily, and then it can be when the ileum or the colon, part of the colon heals, then colostomy is reverted. Treatment of lymphoma: it depends upon the stage of the disease. Limited disease or stage 1, resection without chemotherapy. Extensive disease, systemic chemotherapy and radiotherapy. Resection of primary intestinal lymphoma recommended even stage 3 or 4 disease. Surgical debulking may improve survival. So even if it is stage 3 or 4, surgical resection improves the survival, right? Now, references I have taken from current medical diagnosis and treatment edition 2022. It is still 2021 November, so it will help you. And what I have to say, if you are given a scenario of Crohn's disease only, and they have asked differential diagnosis, so what will the differential diagnosis of Crohn's disease, like intestinal tuberculosis, irritable bowel syndrome, and Yersinia enterocolitica, and amoebic dysentery you can make. And in irritable bowel syndrome, there will be never will be bleeding, rectal bleeding. There will be no weight loss. There will be no nocturnal diarrhea, and patient will bring, whenever, if there is a first visit to you of the patient who is suffering from IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, then he will have a big pile of investigation in his file, and it is written by Harrison that big pile of investigation will be brought in the initial visit, which will give you a clue that patient has irritable bowel syndrome, because everybody has temptation to investigate from the very beginning if all the investigations are normal. So if all the investigations are normal, the colonoscopy and the sigmoidoscopy and the CT scan and everything, then think about IBS. There will be no nocturnal diarrhea, there will be no rectal bleeding, there will be no weight loss in irritable bowel syndrome. There will be some, stress, anxiety symptoms in that patient. Okay, so I think I have completed this, and I was just wondering if you can send me latest theory exam paper, because I haven't seen any since decades. So if you can send me some papers, I can solve them for you too. I will enjoy what they are asking nowadays. Okay. So I think it's enough for you. I in detail Crohn's disease because you have to be very meticulous. If any long case comes of a specific disease, you should know each and everything about that patient. Because you know, when we are studying as residents, I remember when I used to study, I should focus only on the etiology of the disease, on the signs, symptoms of the disease, and on the treatment, right? Investigations and the treatment. And what will happen if the patient does not respond to specific treatment? What will you do if the patient develops complications? What you will do? You know, because the patient will be coming to you when you are to you only when you are working as a consultant, and you have to treat that patient all the time. I mean, he will be coming back to you. You have to solve the problem. So you should think about complications. You should think about associations. You should think about the what you will do if the patient does not respond. So each and everything is important, and the examiner asks exactly the same thing, because you know it is very important. You cannot leave these prognosis and how will you counsel the disease until and unless you don't know the complications, until and unless you don't know how to treat each and every scenario that will be followed by the course of the disease. So you should know it, because later I came to know how important it is, because as residents we leave so many things when we are studying any of the disease, right? So in your final in your grand viva of your long case, if you have reached till the diagnosis and the treatment, they have reached, the examiner have reached asking you the treatment, I think you are passed. Because they decide or they get it before even making the diagnosis that you will pass. So you know, you should keep it in mind, all the scenarios, the prognosis and the treatment and the complications, what will happen in each and every scenario, right? So thank you so much. Next time we will discuss any other case, and please do write me your comments. How do you find my case discussions? Okay, thank you so much. Okay, Khuda Hafiz.